That is a very important takeaway in terms of what Donald Trump now sees as the future of closing in and ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Going into this summit, there was hard posturing from Trump's side, where he said that if Russia doesn't agree, there'll be very hard consequences. Devastating consequences was the kind of messaging that Donald Trump gave to Russia ahead of that meeting. But there's been a complete change of stance after over 2.5 hours when the two leaders spoke at length, the longest they have face-to-face. There's been a complete change in tack, with now Donald Trump saying that Ukraine will have to then identify and close that deal. Now, the other big story, the other big takeaway of this is that he has delayed the sanctions that he spoke about earlier. Even going into this meeting, he had said that there will be devastating secondary sanctions that could be imposed on Russia if they don't accept what would be Donald Trump's peace formula for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That hasn't happened. Far from it. There was no mention of sanctions. There was only mention of bonhomie, and there was display of handshakes and warm gestures. No threatening sanctions being spoken about. Now, what does that mean? How does that add up going forward? And also, most importantly, the impact this is likely to have in terms of India. Those are questions that we will continue to decode for you viewers and try and get answers to, because this impacts New Delhi simply because of the very irrational, irresponsible measures taken by the Trump administration to single out India, even as it is not the largest importer of Russian oil. But there's relief coming in from Russia, for Russia right now, with no sanctions being imposed. Let's also now get in our guest joining us on the broadcast, Michael Feller, Kamran Bukhari, who will speak to us in terms of what this means, how things add up right now, and whether or not there will actually be a peace formula going forward, and what would that be if not swapping of territories, which is what Russia wants, which is what Ukraine will not allow, and something that EU and NATO allies have been resisting all along. All right. Before we get in, Michael, as well as Kamran Bukhari, let's tell our viewers in terms of the 5 big takeaways that are there. The first and foremost takeaway of this summit today. First, the positive signs, but no deal. Now, this is something very important. As we've been talking about the body language, that's been extremely positive, but there's no deal on the table. Let's remember that. And in Donald Trump's words, if there is no deal, there isn't one to talk about. Let's move ahead and tell you the other big takeaway of this meeting. Second one, no word on a Zelensky meeting. Going into the summit, Donald Trump had said that the second summit would have Zelensky as well. But that hasn't been spoken about today when the meeting ended. It only ended with the possibility of the second summit taking place in Moscow, and Zelensky is unlikely to be part of that. Now, the third key takeaway is that Putin said that Ukraine's security must be ensured. He spoke at length about also in that short briefing. He did mention a lot about Ukraine being, the brothers for Russia. There is a certain historical connection there. And in relation to that, this was an important takeaway that he mentioned. In fact, if we have, I believe we also have the RT stand-up. We also have a short walkthrough that has been done by Russia Today's correspondent Igor Piskunov to talk more about what this means, the takeaways that we are talking about here. Let's listen into what Igor had to say. We come back and talk more on this.
Well, I have to start by saying that it was quite an interesting culmination of this historic meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump here in Anchorage. A bit unexpected, because journalists were expecting to be given an opportunity to ask some questions, but the two presidents apparently decided just to refrain themselves with making statements without receiving any questions. But I think the general tone of that final news conference coincided with the general vibe of the entire meeting, and it's I think, about, I wouldn't call it friendship, perhaps that would be too early, but it's definitely about companionship, starting from how Vladimir Putin was greeted here. And we talked about this quite some time, but I still want to repeat it, that the show that the American side, the receiving side, really put on, involving the fighter jets accompanying Putin's plane, and then the simultaneous exit of both presidents from their airplanes on their airstrip, them walking towards one another, shaking hands, smiling, having a small conversation, and then suddenly and unexpectedly Donald Trump asking Vladimir Putin to get into his car and then driving him off to start that official part of the meeting. So there's a lot of unexpected events happening here, and I think in that sense the final news conference also coincided with that atmosphere. But we know from both leaders that they obviously discussed bilateral relations, and Vladimir Putin started the news conference by calling Donald Trump his neighbor, and he said that is definitely a positive thing in this relationship. Donald Trump, it seemed, was quite optimistic about the meeting, and he was also saying that he wants to continue these contacts with Russia, and he said that it could happen very soon. In fact, Vladimir Putin ended his statement by inviting Donald Trump to Moscow, to which the American president had quite an interesting reaction. He said he's probably going to get a lot of heat for that.
So that was, remember, the Russia Today correspondent reporting from Anchorage. So this is a lot of Russian view as well that we wanted to put out for our viewers to understand, not the view of NDTV. Let's now get in Michael Feller, co-founder of chief strategist of Geopolitical Strategy, joining us on the broadcast from Melbourne. Michael, how do you read the summit? Who holds the cards is something I'm going to come to in just a bit. But your thoughts on the summit, and following that, Donald Trump's pressure tactics, where he's now asking Zelensky to say essentially that you've got to accept the deal for it to move ahead.
Yeah, thanks, and good to be here again. So I see this very much as, while Trump was emphasizing that a deal hadn't been reached, the fact that he's now putting this upon Zelensky, it does sound like a deal was reached, at least between Putin and Trump. And now it seems that they're jointly offering this to Ukraine and Europe. So quite an extraordinary turn of events, in my view. I wasn't expecting them to get that far. Trump, of course, was describing this initially as a listening meeting to feel out Vladimir Putin, but it seems that in their 2.5 hours alone in a room, they seem to have prepared some kind of joint proposal for Zelensky. So yeah, we'll see in the days ahead.
Mm-hmm. Days ahead, there seems to be, and also some reports indicate, Michael, that it was actually Russia's peace formula that came up on the table for discussions, or could be potentially the starting point. If that were so, if I'm saying, because we don't have a formal word on that, there are reports indicating that, if that were the case, that it was the Russian formula that was the starting point of negotiations, that itself gives Russia an upper hand in the conflict negotiations and resolution, doesn't it?
Yes, it would be very worrying in Kiev and Brussels that Russia's formulation, which has been fairly consistent over the last year or so, essentially Crimea plus 4 oblasts in the east, plus NATO's exit from Ukraine, Ukraine's neutrality. That's not a good deal from Zelensky's perspective, I would think. And further, it would require Zelensky to hold a referendum for constitutional change to give up those territories, and presumably at the same time we would see a Ukrainian presidential election. So, yeah, I wouldn't be too happy if I were him.
Indeed. Now, which also brings me to ask that the shockwaves that must have gone up in all European capitals after the possibility of the second summit being in Moscow, which also rules out any presence of Ukraine whatsoever, it potentially then means a continuation of the talks that happened between Russia and USA today, and that would continue going forward. And which would also mean that this is more about the bilateral relationship between the two countries than about conflict resolution.
Yeah, I very much doubt there will be a meeting in Moscow, because Trump said it himself, he would get too much domestic heat for that. You know, what he calls the Russia hoax, or the claims of the Kremlin's electoral interference in 2016. Further, as you pointed out, Zelensky can't be expected to go to Moscow either. So whilst there may be future bilateral US-Russia summits, whether in Moscow or elsewhere, for the purposes of a Ukraine deal, I expect the next meeting, trilateral or otherwise, will have to be in a more neutral place, whether it's Alaska again, or whether it's back in the Middle East, where analysts initially thought such a meeting would be held.
Indeed, it was expected to be in UAE originally, this summit. And let's get in Dr. Kamran Bukhari as well. He's joining us from Virginia, near Washington, D.C. He's the senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, to talk more about what could be the venue of the next summit. But, before I get in, Dr. Bukhari, let's complete the loop here and complete the conversation, Michael, which is that if things were to go from here forward, which direction do you expect that to be? Do you think it's going to be around Ukraine being asked to get the territory swap going, finish the process of conflict resolution, because Trump is unlikely to bankroll any of Ukraine's military needs going forward?
Well, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because my biases are with Ukraine, but I think that Ukraine will lose.
But the whole job of being a strategist is that you've got to keep your biases aside. But go ahead, yeah.
Or at least declare them at the outset. But I do think that Ukraine will have to either accept a deal or see those territories lost in conflict. Russia in recent days has broken through the eastern lines near Pokrovsk, or north of Pokrovsk, which is the so-called fortress city in Ukraine's east. So right. I see that as inevitable, really.
Michael, I've got someone who's got a bias in favor of Donald Trump as well for you on the broadcast. Let's get in Matt Klink to talk more about which way this is likely to end. He's joining us from California, a Republican strategist. Matt, now, since we've spoken in the last couple of hours, there's updates that have come in after the summit. The Donald Trump has spoken to an American network and has said that now it's up to the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, to accept the deal. What deal are we talking about? It's back to territory swaps, something that is a no-go for Ukraine, for Europe.
You're assuming that that's the case. Again, I watched that interview, and Donald Trump was very coy about saying anything specific until he talks with President Zelensky. So I will add, I heard your conversation a minute ago. I can pretty much, the only thing I can guarantee is that if there is a next meeting, it will not be in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're not talking about the fact that Moscow may or may not be the case. That has its own set of caveats. But I want to focus on how this war is likely to end. There is a sense that there is some amount of pressure tactics being imposed or on Ukraine, on Zelensky, in the wake of what was a very cordial summit between Trump and Putin. Is that how you see it?
It was a very, very friendly summit between both presidents. What I can tell you is that Donald Trump, as a businessman, always looks at leverage. And right now, America has leverage on both parties. We have leverage on Ukraine because Ukraine ultimately needs our weaponry and our money to fight this war to basically a standstill. And Trump has leverage on Putin because if he reimposes primary sanctions or imposes primary and secondary sanctions, he can do significant damage to the Russian economy. Now, what Donald Trump is hoping is that none of that has to occur, and that phase two would be a tripartite meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Putin. And at that point, the least the two people are talking, they hate each other, at least get them in the same room. And that's how peace is made.
Right.
But I think your colleague is right that ultimately, if peace is not negotiated, Russia is going to continue to slowly, and the underline on the word slowly,
right,
erode Ukraine's capabilities.
All right. Let's leave it there. Always a pleasure to have Matt Klink and Michael Feller on the broadcast to talk more about which way this is set to go from here. We don't know. The world doesn't know. Most certainly, Ukrainian President Zelensky also has no clue at this stage. His country's fate was being decided without him being in the room. On that note, viewers, a quick break. We return with more stories and more updates on the other side of this broadcast. Stay with us.